and welcome to another episode of the Global Tales of Carbon Transition podcast. I'm Jacqueline, and I'm joined today by Joachim and Eric, my co-hosts. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking to Tim Figgers, Partner and Associate Director, EU and Global Trade and Investment at Boston Consulting Group. Tim is a senior expert on geopolitics and trade impact within BCG's Global Advantage practice, and he's also a member of the BCG Center for Climate and Sustainability Policy and Regulation. Thanks for joining us today, Tim.
Thank you very much. Great to be with you all today. Good to see you.
Tim, perhaps to kick us off, could you tell us a bit about your own professional and decarbonisation journey?
Yes, absolutely. So as you say, I'm now work at this interface between geopolitics, trade and climate. And I've been doing that with global businesses as part of the BCG team for nearly 5 years now. But before that, I spent about 20 years as a policymaker and regulator, both working for the British government, and then I spent time in Brussels working for the European institutions. And then I was involved a bit with the politics of the energy transition in the UK, including through the first stages of the Brexit period. And then I went to work for one of the UK's main manufacturing trade associations with a lot of members involved in energy intensive industrial processes. So I've been involved both from the regulatory and policy side and from the business side. And it's great now to bring together both my knowledge of how policymakers think about this and what the science says with what businesses actually need to do and need to be incentivized and supported to do in order to actually deliver on decarbonisation.
Thanks. So, even looking at your own professional trajectory, I think, something we are seeing, and we're seeing it in the world, is this increased interlinkage between trade, geopolitics, and climate, with climate being linked in some way to energy. And I'm interested, Tim, how you would define the energy transition in today's geopolitical landscape. And tagged on to that, which regions or countries do you see as potential winners or losers?
Well, I guess we are seeing climate becoming an increasingly geopolitical issue and an issue that is becoming more contested in politics in a number of jurisdictions than it previously was, which is perhaps a shift from where we might have been a few years ago with the development of the global institutions and agreements that are there to support climate. But I guess what I really see is the climate and trade agendas coming together in a way that they didn't really before. So, for example, in Dubai, at the Dubai COP28, a couple of years ago, I was there. That was the first COP where there was a trade day. Previously, you'd had the World Trade Organization doing its things about trade over in Geneva, and you'd had the UNFCCC and the COP process doing its things in whichever global city it was established in for a particular year. But the two hadn't really connected. And I think 2 years ago was a realization that you can't deliver decarbonisation without trade, but equally you have to find a way to decarbonise trade in order to deliver on climate action. Now, I guess to answer the second part of your question, once you start thinking about it in those terms, and you see, for example, that no one country could decarbonize itself without engaging in trade, whether that's trade in services to get advisors or IP or tech that it needs to decarbonize, or whether, for example, it's trade, let's say, in critical minerals that it requires that it might not have itself in order to power technology like batteries or wind turbines. You kind of then start to realize that the two agendas need to come much more closely together. But also that starts to lead you to think about, well, who might be advantaged or disadvantaged in different ways. Now, I would say that to be successful in decarbonisation, you need to have access to skills, you need to have access to technology, and then you need to have access to key inputs, the two main ones being critical minerals and green electricity or renewable electricity. So that means that some countries that maybe were previously advantaged because they happen to have hydrocarbons of various sorts will be less advantaged. But other places, like let's say Northern Europe or Brazil or Sub-Saharan Africa, that have got green power or critical minerals, or in some cases both, may find themselves to be more advantaged in a more decarbonized world.
Tim, can I build a little bit on that with the question?
Of course.
um, so, if you have today the advantage of very good wind conditions, hydropower, a lot of solar, and so on, uh, is there an opportunity for these countries then not to be a winner only when it comes to producing green energy, but also take a step forward in the value chain, which ultimately could mean that there is a dislocation of the current value chain. So stuff getting produced more in these countries to become green products, and then you ship those products to the markets rather than you ship the green energy, so to speak.
Yes, I think that's certainly possible. Although there are challenges in the transport of some
Sure.
products like hydrogen, for example. But I think I see that debate being made most forcefully actually around critical minerals. So it's a very, very live debate in places like sub-Saharan Africa to
Yes,
say that as
I mean also beyond shipping the hydrogen, to use the hydrogen to produce something
you
from
could you could do that. You certainly could do that. And if you we talked about Brazil already, but Brazil is very interesting because it has renewable energy. It has aspirations to produce significant amounts of green hydrogen, but it also has an established industrial base in sectors like steel that would then require that green hydrogen in order to produce green versions of the products they're currently producing in quite a
so
carbon
so so
intensive
if
way.
you Tim, if you don't have this quote unquote advantage, you can end up a bit on the loser side in this game then.
Yeah, you potentially, but that also depends, I guess, on how you shift and diversify your own economy. I guess
Exactly.
the projections for the energy transition show that the demand for the kinds of products and technologies we're talking about is likely only to increase. So I don't think this is a zero sum game where if I have it, I've got to take it off you. I think there's enough for everybody.
Sure.
But what's necessary, I guess, is for economies everywhere to kind of understand how this is likely to unfold and think about their own strategies to capture as much of the value from the energy transition and green growth for themselves.
I'd like to build on that. I think I'm more like, let's say, make countries like Switzerland. Will that model be successful in in the next 2 decades, where you actually really don't have much resources, but can be a very rich economy? So I think there is definitely, at least the past learns us that control of critical minerals and energy sources is not necessarily the recipe for being an industrial leader. So perhaps there I may take a slightly different view from my co-host Joachim, or at least from the questioning point of view. I wonder if there is, it's all about governments these days, it seems. I wonder if there is a role for corporations to drive it. I, I mean, they are seen to be, let's say, some of them, and I take an example of a beer brand, Heineken. They want to be, green beers, not just because their bottles are green. They want by 2030 to sell green beer. And they, for example, actively invested in a green ammonia hydrogen driven producer called Fertiggy. And so they are actually really taking an effort themselves to go down the value chain, turn the green hydrogen green, then make green ammonia, which then in turn delivers green fertilizer, which they can then eventually use through the value chain to make green malt, which then goes into beer, and you create basically really green beer. So this kind of, let's say, corporate upstream movement, I think we see the same doing with Maersk, a global shipper, who basically start up a business unit that makes green methanol, which eventually will go into their green ships. So this kind of corporate activism, I mean, if you open Financial Times, you would see it doesn't exist. But actually, when you look, it exists. Could we see more of this in COP30 and globally? What do you think?
Well, I think what we need is to see companies and governments working together, because you've given some good examples there of companies that have moved forward. But if you look at the example of Maersk, they've also been one of the leading advocates for a global carbon price on shipping to kind of level the playing field and require all ship operators to embrace decarbonisation of shipping. And while they didn't quite get it to the extent I think they would have liked, and nevertheless, they and others lobbied hard, and the International Maritime Organization has now agreed effectively to move to a carbon price on international shipping. So I think that's a good example where a company leads, but also it probably does require cooperation with government or regulatory organizations in order to ensure everyone is competing on a fair playing field. Because otherwise, if the costs of inaction you get too far out from the costs of action, then it kind of undermines the ability for people to move forward.
Tim, on this discussion about sort of cooperation and competition, which I think is very interesting in the current climate. And actually, I read something that you wrote the other day, which said that, in this increasingly multipolar world, we focus too much on competition and too little on collaboration. And I'm interested, I think the example you just gave, are there other examples how we can practically implement cooperation? And feeding into this, because tariffs are a big trade issue, but feeding into this idea of cooperation and working together, I'm interested to hear your views on the CBAM. Does it truly level the playing field for EU producers? And do EU producers actually need the playing field to be leveled?
Oh, that's quite a lot of questions there
Yeah.
to work through. So I'll come back to the broader point about cooperation in a minute, but let's just focus on the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism. And I think increasingly we should talk not just about the CBAM, by the way, but CBAMs, because they are proliferating. Well, the EU is the first. We now have the UK and Norway, both saying that they'll introduce one a year later in 2027. And we've got places like Canada, Australia, Switzerland, and maybe other places as well, also looking quite closely at the experience of the early adopters and maybe introducing a carbon-based import tariff of their own further down the line, because they're all suffering from the same issue. I see CBAMs as a consequence of a more multipolar world. In a world where we did have a truly global collaboration on decarbonisation, and we had a global carbon price like the OECD and IMF and others have been calling for a long time, then you wouldn't need carbon border adjustments. But if we have a world as we do, where some parts of the world are moving more quickly towards net zero than others, then the issue of carbon leakage is one that has to be addressed and can't just be swept under the carpet. You can debate the extent to which it happens, but it nevertheless is an issue. And if you were talking to, let's say, the European steel industry or the European cement industry or a sector like that, they would definitely tell you that they couldn't accept and couldn't deal with carbon prices rising above a certain level and the removal of the free permits they currently get under the EU ETS without some other mechanism of stopping globally traded products coming into the EU and undercutting their own products. So I don't think we can pretend it's an issue that can be ignored. And what the European Union has done, I think, is to be, in my view, really, really, really welcomed. And I know others might not agree with that, because what they've done is they've taken something that was very conceptual, a conceptual idea amongst economists, and tried to turn that into a practical policy to be implemented on the ground. Now, they didn't get it right first time. They've already gone through one revision, and I'm sure there'll be more changes as the mechanism settles down. But they've taken something that most people said, or many people said, was impossible to implement, and actually are getting on and implementing it. And I think they should get credit for that.
Thanks,
Here,
Tim.
here.
Yeah. Thanks. I think that that's a nice, you know, even I told you I have some criticism sometimes of the CBAM, but I think that in the broader idea of decarbonization and how you've just explained it, it does make sense. I also, would you say that it's one of the ways that the EU is using its market size to actually influence the energy transition?
Yes, absolutely. Or rather, it's using its access to its market to try to incentivize the decarbonisation of global supply chains. Now, I appreciate it might not feel like that if you are, elsewhere in the world with a supply chain going to the EU, and it feels like regulation is being imposed on you extraterritorially. But that is one of the reasons why the EU is doing that, and the other reason they're doing it is to try to maintain confidence in the energy transition within the European Union. I think we're having this discussion at a really interesting time geopolitically. I was just reflecting on that earlier before coming on, because there are two really big debates about to be concluded. So one is what will remain of the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States once the budget bill gets passed, where we are right in the thick of incredibly forensic lobbying from various interests pushing in different directions, and we don't yet know what will be left, but we can be sure that what remains will be rather less than what was implemented by the Biden administration. And then here in Europe, of course, we're at the final stages of the debate about what should the European Union's 2040 greenhouse gas reduction target be. 90% is the number that's out there. And to what extent should European Union member states be able to meet that target by action elsewhere in the world, rather than, as is currently the case, having to do everything within the territory of the European Union itself. And the outcome of both those debates, very, very big geopolitical debates happening right now, will shape, I guess, both the global and then regional direction of travel, of incentives and regulation and business actions and investment and trade, and all of these things we've been talking about over the next 10 to 15 years. So we really are at quite an important moment as we sit here in early June having this conversation.
We are always very timely. And just to give you a figure, I was really flabbergasted reading up that Europe, just in 2020 and 2021, through its member states, allotted 3.1 trillion euro state aid, of which 80% went to Germany, France, and Italy. The rest got spread across the rest of the EU. But I mean, that actually means we had 3.1 trillion just to direct. There was post-COVID recovery, and which was 11.7 GDP. But I mean, economists now kind of counted it. If you then look underneath that amount, actually it looks like maybe only 1/3 of this was probably really spent. So, and we are still kind of to see the results. But let's say European financial power, I mean, it's amazing, right? So it's out there. So maybe a question to build on, maybe there is no problem for Europe in this new global world. I mean, it seems we just have this incredible wealth, we can relax, let US and China, have some conflict and, just sit back, drink margaritas and, come back in 5 years and everything's going to be beautiful. And by the way, we have this beautiful CBAM wall, which you just complimented. So we are totally safe in Europe, behind that CBAM wall. So, should we go and drink margaritas and take sabbaticals?
No, I think there's a bit of work to do, Eric, before we can all go to the beach. Lovely though the weather is out there at the moment. I think I think your point about COVID spending is an important one, and it does show that if you can persuade the EU member states, and particularly the German government, to let the European Union borrow money at the EU level, you can leverage a very significant amount of cash. And I would just say, though, in fairness, that about a third of the allocated money under the Recovery and Resilience Facility was supposed to be spent on industrial decarbonisation. Another third was supposed to be sent on things to do with tech and digital in some kind of way, and the other third on kind of everything else. So, there was a channeling of that money to say, that if as we're recovering from COVID, we'd better use this money and align it with the energy transition if we can. To be fair. Yeah, I mean, I also was thinking when you were saying it, Eric, that Mario Draghi would agree with you. If you look at what he wrote in his very, very important report issued last autumn, and there's a lot there about energy competitiveness and what he calls a competitiveness first energy transition, including thinking about decarbonisation and addressing the challenges that energy intensive industries in the EU face. His clear prescription is investment at scale at the European level. So I think he would certainly align with that. I guess the challenge is, firstly, there are other spending pressures that have come along, not least defence at the European level, as a consequence of other geopolitical developments on both sides of the Atlantic. That is a key focus. And I'm speaking to you on the day that the UK, for example, issued its defence spending plans and set out how it was going to very significantly increase the amount of money that's going on defence. And I guess if that's where the focus is, then maybe the money and incentives that previously were around for climate might feel the pinch a bit as governments seek to rein in their budgets.
So no relaxation, but investment. I know that Joachim is maybe also has some slightly different views again to me and Jackie. So Joachim, maybe you want to throw a grenade in there as well?
No, can just take it. Okay, let's take a brutal one, Eric. Then, does Europe matter in this context, or does it matter going forward? I mean, it's a declining economy on a relative scale. We see how things are beefing up. I just spent a couple of weeks in Asia, in China and Southeast Asia, and the level of activities, when you see the level of technology. I had to do some work to get 3 QR codes to enter Indonesia, and everything is based on that kind of stuff. We run around in electrical cars in Jakarta, and so on and so forth. And they're coming back to, I live currently in Munich, and taking back, as always, when I come to Munich, taking back a decade or two when I'm coming from Asia. Still, we talk a lot about Europe. We talk a lot about Europe in the context of decarbonization and energy transition. Looking at the figures in Germany, well, a lot of money going in, but not a lot of results. What is the relevance going forward? When we love Europe, we all live in Europe, so don't get me wrong, but will we have a big role going forward, do you think?
Well, I think, again, I'd come back to what Mario Draghi was saying. I think the next few years will determine whether that is the case or not. I mean, as people who live in Europe, we should care, I guess, about the decarbonisation of our continent and the extent to which we can transition
but will we continue? I think that we have been a bit of a role model and had a certain leadership here, but will that be maintained, you think?
Well, I think that very much depends on the evolution of policy and incentives over the next period. I mean, I think there's no doubt, I think, that Europe has been a leader, particularly in types of regulation, like things like carbon pricing. The European Union, the EU ETS was the world's first comprehensive carbon pricing system. And as we've just been discussing, things like the CBAM, which effectively are a carbon pricing mechanism for imports, the EU has shown leadership there. So when it comes to these kinds of market-based mechanisms, the European Union has leveraged its scale and its expertise to set a path that others are following. But I guess and maybe the Inflation Reduction Act, when it was originally proposed, showed this. On the other side of the equation, in terms of carrots rather than sticks, the EU has been less strong, partly because it doesn't have much money at the European level. It's mostly at the member states, and also because the European Union, has historically not really liked subsidies or incentives of various sorts, and tends to put pretty tough conditions around those, as anyone bidding for money from the EU Hydrogen Bank has found out. I think that the Clean Industrial Deal published a couple of months ago is an interesting development, and clearly the geopolitical balancing act that the current European Commission is trying to do is to say, we'll keep with a 90% net zero target. We're not going to roll back our ambition. But to get there, we need a more balanced combination of carrots and sticks rather than a load of sticks and hardly any carrots. But again, the ability to deliver on that comes essentially back to money and the willingness of member states to put money on the table or give the European Commission the resources it needs to do that, or failing that, to put their own hands in their own pockets to run national schemes.
Flowing from that, Tim, and I recognize before we go into our final segment, perhaps as one of my last questions, I'd love to know, because obviously this is what you do, you advise people on trade policy. If you were advising EU leaders on energy transition trade policy, what would be your sort of top 3 recommendations? And as someone from the Global South, how would these differ from how you would advise sort of Global South leaders?
Well, for the EU, I would very much build on what Mario Draghi says. I think investment at scale, deepen the single market, so focus on internal trade within the European Union, because that's the most insulated from geopolitical disruption, and then think about developing relationships with new markets, mainly in the Global South, including for things like critical minerals. If I was in the Global South or advising leaders in the Global South, I would say, first and foremost, think about your carbon competitiveness. Now, people like me, when we work with businesses and governments, historically talk a lot about economic competitiveness. Now, if you're exporting something or you're producing something, how competitive is your product versus all the other people who are making or exporting the same thing globally? But in a world of carbon pricing and carbon border adjustments and so forth, carbon competitiveness also becomes an issue, because if you're only making brown steel or grey steel rather than green steel, or grey hydrogen rather than green hydrogen, or whatever it might be, then your carbon competitiveness is less than another country that has got ahead of you in the energy transition. And so that's something, if you're a Global South country exporting, you kind of need to look at and think about how quickly do you develop and improve your carbon competitiveness to remain effective in global trade.
Jackie, we don't hear you.
Gosh, stuck in 2020, muting my microphone.
You were
I'm just saying,
flabbergasted by Tim's reply. I understand. So you're.
Yes.
no, but I was really saying thank you so much, Tim. I think that we could actually speak about this for hours, because so I'm remembering something my first boss told me when I walked into his office, and he said, energy is inherently political, Jackie. Like, when you talk about energy, you need to understand so many different other aspects of the political landscape. And I think we've just sort of touched the surface. But we need to come to an end. And we have a segment on our show where we ask, first I'll ask the co-host, and then I'll ask you, if the listeners could take away one thought or idea from our conversation today to discuss around the coffee cart with their colleagues, what would you want that to be? And Eric, I'll ask you first, what is the thought that has stuck with you from this conversation?
Well, 2 thoughts. One, that I just after this half an hour, I would hire Tim if I had to ask a geopolitical expert. Before this half an hour, I didn't know for sure, but Tim at least convinced me. It comes from the deep of my heart. But so this was really great. But now, on a second note, I think we should all print on our coffee cups the word carbon competitiveness. And I think we should hand out those coffee cups, and maybe BCG wants to sponsor them, at COP30. So I would say hashtag carbon competitiveness and hand them out to all those candidates in Bellon. Probably recyclable cups, but there we go. So that's my few cents. Watering some ideas here. So on to Joachim, maybe.
Yeah, Eric, I do love your idea about the carbon competitiveness coffee cups, CCCC, right? Absolutely support that. One thought that was coming a bit to my mind here that we touched upon here and maybe should discuss more even, is that we're going from a monopolar moment, if you like, into a multipolar, multi-nodes world. And you mentioned cooperation in that one. And I think that there are areas where you can greatly cooperate and the areas where you might not cooperate, and that goes between the same two parties, so to speak. We had a situation in the past where we always had to cooperate with about everything with the same guys, sort of simplified. But I think that is a change, and I think you alluded to that very much, Tim. And I think that's a takeaway for me going forward. And I think that's a very constructive pathway. Simply, thank you.
Thanks, Joachim. Yeah, Tim, for me, there's so many takeaways. I think definitely, and something I've seen across all of our podcasts is this idea of cooperation where there can be cooperation, especially cooperating in this time, which is very competitive. And I think you also gave me some thoughts about the CBAM that I will go home and think a bit more about. So thank you for that. But Tim, to end off, could you tell us what would you like our listeners to go away with?
I'd like the listeners to think about the concept of co-opetition. So hashtag co-opetition. Maybe we can get some other coffee cups and write that on them to go alongside Eric's ones, and we can give everybody free coffee cups in Brazil in November. It is a real word. I did check it out in the dictionary, and I've written an article about it, which you can see on the bcg.com website. And really, it basically says, in a more multipolar world, we need to compete where it makes sense and cooperate where we can. We shouldn't see this as either waiting for global cooperation to happen before making any moves. Equally, we shouldn't just give up and compete on everything. There are some things where it makes sense to compete, and others, for example, around standards and reporting, where global cooperation makes sense and is perfectly compatible with competition in other areas of the energy transition.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us. It's been a wonderful time, and I hope everyone enjoyed the episode. Join us next month. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.